Welcome to Discovering Orthodox Christianity. I'm Stacy Spanos, your host for this series of programs designed to explain the basic teachings of Orthodox Christianity. We're honored to be filming at the Holy Cross Chapel on the campus of Hellenic College, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Boston. So in today's program, we'll discuss faith and popular culture. Can they coexist? Our guest today is one of the leading experts on the subject within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, Metropolitan Savas of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for being here, Your Eminence.
My pleasure, Stacy.
So how is it that you became interested in pop culture to the point where you're the leading authority in the Archdiocese?
That is quite a mantle to be wearing, yeah. You know, I've always been interested in popular culture ever since I was a kid. And it's hard to say. I mean, you might as well ask a kid, you know, when did he become interested in comic books? When did he become interested in television shows? When did he become interested in music? You know, it just happens. The thing is, I think I never really outgrew that. You know, I've always kept an eye and ear open to those things because I didn't necessarily experience them as threatening to the faith. You know, I saw them as expressions of truth and beauty. And as such, you know, I kind of go along with the line of St. Justin, the philosopher, the apologist, Justin Martyr, who was a great saint of the mid-2nd century, around the year 150. And he was trying to explain Christianity to a pagan world. He wasn't necessarily addressing Jews like St. Paul was, who were struggling with this new message, but he was explaining it to the wider Greek culture. And he was saying, you know, that whatever is beautiful, whatever is true, whatever is just, participates in the beautiful, the true, the just, God. You know, that there aren't other kinds of beauty, there aren't other kinds of truth, that there's one beauty and one truth. And if wherever you see it, as a Christian, it belongs to you. You can appropriate it. You know, if you discover diamonds in the dung heap, you know, pick them up. You know, they're yours for the taking. So that's just an attitude that I've always had. I recognize that there's traps. I recognize that popular culture can be understood as a kind of a cheap, polluting kind of atmosphere and environment, but I guess I don't dwell on that aspect of it.
You choose to see the beauty, as you said, the diamonds in the dung heap.
Right. Well, not necessarily to see the beauty or the truth, or, you know, sometimes the truth is not necessarily beautiful in a conventional way. But, well, for instance, I think it's very important that we have, as one of our great Orthodox writers, someone like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who communicated Orthodox truths in the context of pulp fiction, you know.
And give me an example.
Well, Crime and Punishment, you know. Of course, it's not, the language of it isn't as crass as what we would associate with pulp fiction, but the concept of a philosopher who's trying to, a student who's trying to test his limits and demonstrate to himself that he's above the law by murdering somebody for no motive other than to prove to himself that he can. And so killing a pawnbroker woman, not to rob her, just because, you know, he can, because he's superior, and with an axe in a very grisly manner. And then having her mentally addled sister walk in on the scene and feeling compelled to cut her up as well, and then having to deal with the consequences on his conscience that he wasn't prepared to, he didn't realize that he was going to have this reaction. And that he's brought to the light by a child prostitute, you know. I mean, these kinds of things kind of validate, the search for truth in unlikely places on the part of us Orthodox. I mean, these stories aren't sanitized in any way. This is going into the slums, going into the gutter, going into the souls of dark people, and so that for me is a kind of a validation, as I said.
You grew up, of course, being inundated with the images that we see, that we get from pop culture, like all of us have here. I'm curious, though, because you said one thing kind of stood out to you, and that was the Da Vinci Code, the book. How did that set you on your journey?
Well, it doesn't stand as... The Da Vinci Code is important in my personal journey for just historical reasons, as it were, because it was well known at the Archdiocese that I was the kind of guy who reads these things, that I don't do anything to suppress that side of me. I'll come into work and I'll ask people if they've heard this or seen this or what they think about that. A young adult group, in the early days of the Da Vinci Code, when it had just come out and it was starting to circulate widely as a book, not a movie, asked if I would speak to them about the subject in Manhattan on 91st Street, the Evangelismos Church there. And they said that they usually get 12 to 20 people on a Thursday, and that I could talk for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then field questions. And I said, okay. And I agreed to it a week before, and they sent out a flyer online that I would be addressing the subject of the Da Vinci Code. And they prepared for 20 or maybe 30 people, and there were 150 people. And it was just a shock to all of us that they were turning people away, and that there was such an interest. What does the church have to say about this? Mm-hmm. And I just realized what an important teachable moment this is. I mean, this Dan Brown, for all his shortcomings, and they are many, he still raised to the consciousness of many people questions of early first century Christian culture, and the role of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the role of woman in the church, and all these kinds of things, and the apocryphal writings, and all this stuff. And people were open to hearing about what the church had to say about that. And so it seemed like everybody wanted to hear about the Da Vinci Code at the time. So I must have given 4 or 5 talks in a 2-month period, and every time I went anywhere, the crowds got bigger. It
does bring up some issues of doubt within the Christian story. Mm-hmm. And there are some, I would imagine, who want to suppress things that raise doubt through the popular culture. What role does the Orthodox Church have in allowing pop culture to be what it is, and in trying to manage it? Can it be managed?
I think a lot of pious Orthodox Christians believe that a phrase that they were told by perhaps their village priest or their grandmother is actually something Jesus said or can be found in Scripture, and that the phrase is "Pisteve και μην ερεύνα," believe and don't ask questions. And it was the defense on the part of people who just didn't feel equipped to answer questions. And so they said, don't probe, I can't help you here. Better that you should just hold on to the simple truths of your faith. Because I didn't learn from anybody. We're not in a circumstance where I could have gone to a seminary. We're just barely keeping the flame alive under adverse conditions. Well, that's not today's world. You can't really, you're not going to get very far if you tell people, don't ask. Once the question's out there, you have to answer it.
What about telling people, avert your eyes?
That's a different thing, I mean, you can choose to live a life where you don't engage in culture at large, popular or otherwise. That's always been an option for the Christian. I'm thinking here of H. Richard Niebuhr in his classic book, Christ and Culture, in which he described 6 paradigms whereby the church has historically understood the relationship between the revealed truth of Christ and the larger world. And the first paradigm that he addresses is Christ versus culture. And that's a very primitive, by primitive I mean it's been with us from the beginning of our experience as a church. You know, that the temptation is to say, Christ is the revealed truth, and there's a clear and distinguishing line of demarcation between his truth and the falsehood. Everything else outside of this clearly defined Christian truth is false. And therefore, build the walls high and stay within your enclosure. And that still exists in monasticism. And by that, I don't mean to be critical of monasticism. It's a way of being in the church. You know, it's an option.
And that seems like the safest route.
Yeah. But, you know, it's not the only.
Yeah.
You know?
And by safe, I mean just keeping your eye on the prize, not being distracted by the noise of popular culture.
Right. But monastics are called to that special relationship. It's a kind of a love affair, you know, and they will give up everything for the lover, for the loved one. And they provide a witness, you know, to the rest of us. It's a prophetic witness, you know, that there's only one thing needful. And they have found that. They found the pearl of great price. You know, it's a beautiful thing. It's a maximalist expression. But it's not the only way. I think that, you know, the church also recognizes and blesses the way of St. Justin Martyr that I mentioned, that sees evidence of the truth in other cultures. You know, that that God revealed himself most clearly and unambiguously in his interaction with the Jewish people, and then in his self-revelation in the person of Christ. But that didn't mean that he wasn't interacting with the rest of humankind. That and there are hints of that everywhere. It's just that you have to make those people hear that the fullness of the message that they're sort of hearing or groping at is to be found in the person of Jesus. It's not really, you know, you could say it's Jesus versus your source of wisdom. But you can also say Jesus completes your source of wisdom.
Let me ask you, because you were telling me a little bit about your background. You entered the clergy in your 30s. Mm-hmm. So you were bombarded by all the messages that the rest of us fall into, and yet you chose a spiritual life, and the rest of us may not. How would you counsel people to, yes, take in the message, see what's out there, revel in the good parts of it, but also stay true to your faith?
You know, I really am not comfortable with this dichotomy of the spiritual life as something, you know, that's happens when you sign on to the ordained ministry or something like that. I mean, this spiritual versus material dichotomy, I think, is not terribly helpful. And you know, we're treating culture sometimes as if it's the product of non-believers, you know, but people who are writing books and people who are writing screenplays and people who are drawing comics and people who are making music, if they're trying to tap the truth, if they're trying to say something truthful about human nature or about the world as it is, I mean, they're often coming from, you know, it's not, they've been drawing from Christian sources themselves all their lives.
Hollywood has for a long time. Give me an example of some that you clearly see spiritual underpinnings or Christian underpinnings in a movie.
You know, whenever the hero sacrifices and gives his life, and his self-emptying liberates somebody, delivers somebody from evil, that person can be described as a Christ figure. Mm-hmm. You know, he may not match up with Christ in every aspect of his life. He may be a convict in the movie. He may be He may be a morally reprehensible person who comes to a moment of enlightenment and gives himself in a moment of love. But you recognize that as a Christ moment, and so...
Well, tell me about Superman and...
Well, yeah, I think I first saw that most obviously in a pop cultural movie in Spider-Man 2. I mean, it was just in your face that, here Spider-Man is trying to save these people who are on a runaway elevated train. It is something as... Doc Octopus has done something to the mechanism of the train, and I think the conductor has died or something, and it's racing down this track, and it's going to fall off the track and into the water. And so Spider-Man jumps in front of the train, anchors himself to the buildings by shooting his web out, okay? And he's saving people in this posture.
Right.
His mask flies off, revealing that he is both super and human. His costume splits right here. He brings him right to the edge, and then he collapses, apparently dead from the effort. And then they bring him in to the train, and they say, he was one of us. He's just a beautiful young boy, And then they try to protect him from Doc Ock, who comes back for him. And they're not capable of doing it on their own, and Spider-Man revives and continues the fight for them. And, so there's a kind of a death and resurrection going on there.
Do you think that's lost on the majority of the audience, or are astute viewers picking that up?
Oh, I think, I don't think I was the only one. I think that's an obvious visual cue. I mean, anytime somebody stretches out their hands like that, it communicates the cross. So, and then, you saw that in Superman too, and came to appreciate that on some level it was always in Superman. In Superman Returns, it becomes really obvious. Not this current Superman, but the one right before, starring Brandon Routh, when, for instance, when he takes all the kryptonite and flings it out to the outer reaches of the galaxy, up in outer space, and then he collapses from the effort. It's just drained him in the form of a cross and plummets to earth, and then is taken as if dead, and there's no signs of life, to the hospital, and the only people who stay with him are his female followers, who persist and come back to see him time and again, even though they're not allowed to. And when they finally get through to the hospital room, there's just the sheets, and the open window.
The resurrection.
He's escaped, And it's so brilliant. I mean, Superman is in his 75th year this year, and he's the work of a kid from Cleveland, Joel Siegel, who came up with this story when he was a teenager. A nerdy teenager, but he came up with a story that had all these incredible mythic and religious undertones. I mean, Superman is from Krypton, okay? Krypton is a Greek word meaning the hidden place. And it's a word that Jesus himself uses in Scripture when describing the kingdom of God. He says the kingdom of God is like a treasure hidden in a field. Thisavron krypton in agrion, Krypton, okay? And then how can you not think of Superman as a baby hidden in a field,
right.
And discovered by John and Martha Kent, whose original names were Joseph and Mary, okay?
Fascinating.
He comes from a place, where his father's name is Jor-El, his own name is Kal-El, in that hidden place. And, that El is a Jewish suffix that communicates the divine. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Our angels have the El suffix. So there's just all this stuff already in the story.
When you point it out, it's obvious, but I'll never watch Superman and Spider-Man the same way again.
Well, I'm not saying that they are, again, everything about them lines up. But there are these moments where what they do, the salvific act that they accomplish, resonates with the genuinely salvific act of Christ on the cross.
What do you make of the fairly recent trend of mainly evangelical Christians getting into the game of establishing popular music and movies and books? The Left Behind series is very popular. I know there are many others as well.
I think sometimes when you're trying to do it, it's less successful than if you're just coming from a Christian conscience. If you're working to use an art form to promote your worldview and your kind of for propagandistic purposes, it's going to feel less authentic. For me, I prefer discovering the Christianity of somebody rather than dealing with it, in a more aggressive manner. Like dealing with the Christianity of Johnny Cash, for instance, who is, especially since his death in recent years, is just, he's just an American icon, as it were. And it's a word that we use a lot. Mm-hmm. But,
truly a troubled man, though.
A troubled man, a man who fought with his demons very openly, with his anger and with his alcoholism and with his heroin addiction, mm-hmm. And yet, his faith remained profound. And so you get a picture of a whole person, warts and all. Mm-hmm. And that's very somehow attractive to us, It's a kind of a
redemption story.
Right, yeah, but one that we can identify with,
Speaking of music, you enjoy the music of the Beatles.
Well, I think I feel very privileged to have been a young person when the Beatles were happening, because that's never going to happen again.
Right.
I think we watched a planet
be transformed by their music.
No, I mean the creation of a planet.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I think that they changed everything.
Right. They changed everything, and yet some of their songs were obviously very controversial. Some of their lyrics were mm-hmm. as well, the themes that they brought up in some of those songs. So how do you, as a man of God, reconcile being okay with that music?
They were, what I think is fascinating about them as a phenomenon is that they began as a purely pop outfit. They were just writing boy-girl songs. I love you, you love me, or, I love you more than you love me, or, I wish you would love me as much as I love you, just kind of that kind of thing. Yeah, that kind of thing. But then they, they're not by themselves. You've got people like Bob Dylan that you have to factor in, mm-hmm. who is using pop music to comment on the state of the world. He's drawing from folk tradition to become a kind of a prophetic critic, and so they're starting to. The world is starting to appear more obviously in their music and their perspective on the world, their commentary on the world. And this is a time when they were, people did look to them for answers, and I guess you had to be there, but there was a kind of a suspicion of older people at the time, because people were speaking to each other from across a great gulf, context is very important.
Sure.
But if you will remember, for instance, that our parents at the time were largely veterans of a good war, an unambiguous war, between good and evil. But we were involved in a much more murky situation.
We were talking about World War II versus Vietnam.
Right. Yeah. And the kids are examining the Vietnam thing, and they're responding to it critically in ways that the parents feel threatened by. What do you mean? This is your duty. We're there. How can you question the government's decision to get us involved in this war? And then comes this shouting match. We're in the greatest country, and the kids are like, yeah, but let's examine what's going on here. And there was a kind of a, you can't teach me anything. I've been to college now. You worked hard to send me to college, and I know the world better than you'll ever know the world. And there was a real, tension. And so the young people were looking for other answers because they felt their parents' answers were not for them, you know? And they looked to the Beatles, who were looking to the East, you know, for an alternative to the kind of Christianity that was dominant in its day, or who were experimenting with mind-altering drugs. Yeah, they may have led many people down dangerous paths, and I'm not going to take that, you know, out of the story. But, you know, the record of the journey is still a vivid one and a fascinating one. And it, you know, the notion that a song.
Well, yeah, let me ask you, the notion that a song or a movie can promote evil or ill will in the world. What do you make of that? Because there are a lot of people who believe that.
Yeah.
And there may be a grain of truth in it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I believe that obviously that can be, you know, it certainly has happened in the past, and that parents have to be on their guard. I think mostly in kind of imposing a set of morals, a sexual moral on kids. I mean, I'm very often very nervous about what kids are listening to when I go to a Goya dance or something like that, and they've just let a DJ spin records, and you know, I don't know that parents are listening closely enough to worry about these songs that are, you know, objectifying women in particular ways and advocating, you know, glorifying violence. I'm not saying that I'm not giving, you know, a blessing with both hands every product of pop culture. And I'm not suggesting that discernment is not an important thing, you know, but I'm just saying that it's not as easy a thing as this show uses foul language and has a violent content, and therefore nothing can be drawn from that.
Because there can be a morality tale, just like Dostoevsky.
Oh, right. I mean, you know, at the right age and for the right person,
sure,
there's something that can be learned from The Sopranos or from Breaking Bad or from Mad Men, you know. But that's not necessarily, just because it's not right for your 16-year-old to watch, doesn't mean that it is not appropriate adult education. I mean, that you can't engage it critically, you know?
So then how do we use our faith in determining what we should watch, what we should listen to? What's the first thing? Like if I'm going into, I don't know, iTunes to pick out songs, or if I'm going to Netflix to look at movies, should I remember first and foremost, I'm an Orthodox Christian? Should I look at something where there's a morality tale? How do you go about it?
I don't know that I put up that I don't listen to something because I realize that now we're getting into the realm of what I would do and what I would recommend. You know, in my own case, I'm not fearful, you know. I mean, I have a degree in English literature. I mean, I've been exposed to schools of interpretation. I know how to interact with literature of a certain kind, and I'm reluctant to pass a quick judgment on something. But I suppose, you know, if it makes you feel uneasy, then that's probably reason enough to, if it troubles your conscience, then, you know, don't probe. I know, I wish I could be a little more concrete.
It's kind of like, I can't remember who said it. I can't remember if it was a Supreme Court justice or a lawmaker. You know, when it's pornography, I know when it's pornography.
Right,
Basically,
exactly.
if your gut's telling you that it's not right for you,
right.
then maybe that should be your gauge.
Right.
Should we as Orthodox Christians be doing more to urge the movie industry to tone it down, to the music industry to tone it down?
You know,
and are we engaged in that at all?
You know, I think that the movie industry and the music industry understands sales. You know, we vote with our dollars. And as long as they keep producing things that we're willing to buy, then they'll keep giving us the same thing. I mean, they're just, that's the purpose of the industry, of the business. And so if we're really concerned about certain kinds of things, we'll just not buy them. And if they produce things that are targeted for us, then we'll react in the way that they expect us to by buying them. But as I said, sometimes, that doesn't work in terms of art. Sometimes it just becomes a kind of commercially viable evangelical Protestant product that is kind of cynically put together in order to address, the finance, to drain a particular audience.
It's very candid. Yeah, true. So let me ask you, what are you reading that you believe would have a positive influence on people watching, or can you recommend any books or literature that you think will steep us in our Orthodox faith or further us along?
Outside of the obvious is what you're saying.
Outside of the obvious, like the Bible.
Well, I would recommend, I think that reread Crime and Punishment. That is a very key text, it seems to me, because, it's also like one of the first genuine detective stories. And it's kind of the detective is a kind of a Columbo in this. And so you see that this is the early days of this particular genre, where the guy knows that Raskolnikov is guilty, but he needs Raskolnikov to know that he's guilty.
Right.
And he's just kind of playing a game of cat and mouse. And it's really about the enlivening of Raskolnikov's consciousness. But that it can be done within this kind of a genre. I think it's important to experience that, But, a go-to person for me, a woman that I think of as a kind of saint, is Flannery O'Connor, a great American writer who was a very deeply, profoundly committed Roman Catholic, and who believed to the core of her being that there is no neutral space, that there is a war going on, and that you're either with the good guys or with the bad guys, and that if you don't know where you are, you're very much in danger of being with the bad guys. But she also believed that God really wanted to save you, and that he could use violence to bring you to your senses, and that sometimes a serial killer holding a gun up to your head becomes a form of grace, because it concentrates the attention, and it gives you that opportunity to deal with the genuinely serious stuff. And though he may be doing something evil by launching that bullet, the bullet coming at you is your moment of salvation, and God snatches the victory from him. She can
Wow.
she works the genre, of the kind of Twilight Zone kind of the evil kind of thing, and shows you that God is constantly fighting to come out on top, and that yeah.
I know that you love literature so much.
Yeah.
I know that you love your faith as well. I think now a lot of us are going to be going back and rereading these classics and watching these movies with a different eye.
Well, I do believe it's about having your eyes open, I used to teach a course at St. Vlad's, or I actually taught it once with one of my Kubati, Professor Peter Butenev, who still teaches systematics at St. Vladimir's Seminary. And I taught it there because I was living in New York at the time. But it was a seminar called Looking for God in Popular Culture. And we would deal with, we'd show sci-fi movies, we'd deal with comic book superheroes, we'd deal with pop music, we would deal with the fantasy genre, with the Lord of the Rings, with the Narnia business, with Star Wars, where there's a clear spiritual component to all those. So, and in fact, I got to say that I'm going to be speaking at the first Doxicon conference outside of Washington, D.C. People who are into sci-fi and fantasy will recognize the word Comic-Con
Sure.
It's a big phenomenon, comic book conventions. Well, the certain group of Orthodox Christians near Washington thought, well, why don't we do a Doxicon convention about orthodoxy and how it interacts with, or what it has to say about sci-fi and fantasy. And I'm a keynote speaker at this. So, you know, I'm very honored by that, and I hope I come up with something meaningful to say.
Well, thank you, Your Eminence.
Thank you.
Metropolitan Savas of Pittsburgh, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you can watch additional programs in this series entitled Discovering Orthodox Christianity by logging on to youtube.com/Greek Orthodox Church. I'm Stacey Spanos. Thanks for joining us.